Good morning, dear guests and colleagues. Welcome to this morning's 2021 Quincentennial webinar organized by the Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office of the Department of Foreign Affairs. To start today's webinar, I wish to request Ms. Daniel Escalante to give the opening prayer, which will then be followed by the singing of the Philippine National Anthem.
Let us put ourselves in the presence of the Lord. God Almighty, we thank you for this opportunity to hold this webinar. May it be a successful webinar and may the presentations instill on our audience members new insights into the distant past and a clearer sense of direction in the now and the immediate future. We thank you for the continued guidance and support that we receive from our colleagues at the Department of Foreign Affairs, and we pray for each other's continued health and well-being. Without them, this webinar would not be possible, and without your divine hand, nothing can come to be. We pray that you continue to protect us from the ongoing pandemic and grant healing to those who have been infected. We ask that you continue to instill in us strength to continue with our daily tasks despite the many hardships brought about by this pandemic, and calm surrender to accept the difficult and unpleasant. This we ask and pray. Amen.
At this point, I have the honor to invite our new Assistant Secretary in the Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office to give the opening remarks. Just to quickly introduce our new Assistant Secretary, Ma'am Maria Angela Ponce joined this office just last week on 22 March 2021, fresh from her assignment at the Philippine Mission to the United Nations in New York, United States of America, where she served as minister. Prior to reposting in New York, Ma'am Ange was assigned to the Philippine Embassy in Paris as First Secretary and Consul and Deputy Permanent Delegate to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO. Ma'am Ange has a Bachelor of Laws degree from the University of the Philippines and a Master of Laws degree from University College London, the United Kingdom. Without further ado, may I request Assistant Secretary Maria Angela Ponce to give the opening remarks.
Thank you, Francis, and good morning to all of our dear colleagues and all of those who are with us today. Our distinguished speakers for today's webinar, my dearest colleagues in the department, guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It is my great honor to welcome all of you to the Quincentennial Commemorations webinar of the DFA's Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office. On behalf of MOAO, I would like to express my deepest appreciation to all of you for attending this webinar, and I wish us all good health and continued safety amidst the challenges brought about by the pandemic. March 2021 is an important month for us Filipinos because we are celebrating the 500th year anniversary of Ferdinand Magellan's arrival in the Philippines and the victory of Mactan. March is also equally important. March is also National Women's Month. For these reasons, our dynamic team here at MOAU, led by Director John Francis Herrera, came up with today's webinar, which will highlight the maritime elements that are relevant to the celebrations. With the aim of strengthening our people's nationalism, love of country, and respect for our heroes, President Rodrigo Roa Duterte created the National Quincentennial Committee to hold activities commemorating the 500th anniversary of the Magellan Expedition. Hopefully, these activities will reinvigorate the sense of nationalism of every Filipino through the commemoration of our ancestors' heroism, humanity, and significant contribution to the first circumnavigation of the world. MOAU is particularly proud to contribute to the realization of these objectives. The first part of the webinar is entitled The Cebuano Pre-Colonial Rivalry, an examination of the maritime conflict that caused Magellan's downfall in the Battle of Mactan. Our speaker is a known history, political science, and international relations scholar. Professor Van Ibiernas will take a multidisciplinary approach as he speaks about the events related to Magellan's arrival in Cebu in 1521. He will attempt to humanize Raha Humabon and Dato Lapu-Lapu by portraying them as leaders who are rather clever and perceptive, rather than naive and nationalistic. He will also explain the importance of controlling the Mactan Channel in the early 16th century, the Blood Compact or Sanduguan as a form of an international treaty, and the factors that contributed to Magellan's loss at the Battle of Mactan. We are also honored to have Dr. Cynthia Zayas of the UP Center for International Studies as our second speaker. She will talk about the historical role of women in the maritime industry in the Philippines. Her topic is entitled Moving with the Wind, the Pangayaw Fisherwoman's Gendered Experience, which will be a lecture focused on the pre-colonial women's roles in the practice of Pangayaw. Dr. Zayas is a maritime anthropologist who specializes in indigenous and local knowledge and how natural disasters and environmental hazards in the Philippines have contributed to the development of Philippine culture. We are hopeful that the lecture will allow all of us to gain a better appreciation of women's roles and women's role in building the maritime history of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, Philippine maritime culture has indeed contributed to the shaping of world history more than we realize. We hope that the topics today will allow us to get acquainted with the first Filipina seafarers, reacquainted with our Cebuano heroes, appreciate our cultural heritage, and instill in us a deep, burning Filipino pride founded on the humanity and triumphs of our ancestors. Before March ends, I would also like to say Happy Women's Month. May we be inspired by all the women who came before us, appreciate their contribution to our society, and continue to thrive and become trailblazers and harbingers of change for the future generations of Filipinos. Thank you and mabuhay.
Our first speaker today is Mr. Vicente Angel S. Ibiernas, a professor of history and international relations in the Philippines and South Korea's most prestigious universities for the past 24 years. He holds a master's degree in political science, major in international relations from the Catholic University of Korea, and a bachelor's degree in history from the University of the Philippines. Professor Ibiernas is a known economic historian who has published work in international peer-reviewed journals on Philippine economic history and international labor and immigration-related issues. Despite the fact that he is currently completing his dissertation to earn his PhD in history from the University of the Philippines, Professor Ibiernas still finds time to write a weekly column for the Manila Times and become a resource speaker for various webinars and online lectures organized by public and private agencies in the Philippines. The most notable of which is the one organized by the National Quincentennial Committee in August 2020, where he gave a presentation entitled Our Ancestors and World Trade in Pre-Hispanic Times. We are grateful that Professor Ibianas has graciously accommodated the Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office to speak in today's webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Van Ibianas, who is giving his talk all the way from South Korea this morning.
Um, Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Mr. John Francis Herrera. Good morning, Assistant Secretary Maria Angela Ponce. And good morning to all of our dedicated public servants at the um, Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office of the Department of Foreign Affairs, as well as the entire department. And lastly, good morning to all of our kababayan who are participating in today's webinar. Okay, um, I only have about 30 minutes, so I'll go straight to my presentation. Wait, let me just share the screen so that you can, so that you can take a look at my PowerPoint presentation. Wait. Okay, yeah. Okay, so the title of my presentation is International Relations Aspects of the Battle of Mactan. Main objective of this presentation is to provide the context for the Battle of Mactan, because the battle itself is fairly well known, especially to Filipinos and even to foreigners, right? So I think instead of focusing on the battle itself, we it's more helpful for us to focus on the context. In particular, the context of international maritime trade, which will help us understand the battle itself, as well as all the other events that happened in 1521. Okay, so let me proceed. Okay, we have we should look at two sets of contexts when we look at the Battle of Mactan. One, of course, is the European context, which in general is summarized in the European Age of Exploration. That is the primary reason why Ferdinand Magellan's expedition found its way into the Philippines. Although, as we know, the uh, objective of the Magellan expedition was to reach the Spice Islands of the Moluccas, and they reached the Philippines by accident. Okay, and on the other side, you have the Southeast Asian Age of Commerce, right? We have to take a look at the regional context, not just the Philippine context, because the Philippine context is part of the regional Southeast Asian Age of Commerce that is also that also revolves around international maritime trade. Okay. For the Age of Exploration, here are some of the most prominent figures, particularly for the kingdoms of Portugal and Spain, right? Okay, so as early as the 13th century, you already have European explorers who were able to reach certain parts of Asia, right? Of course, we have the famous Marco Polo in the 13th century. Although Marco Polo was just one of several Europeans who were able to reach Asia, right? In the 14th century, you have the famous Islamic traveler Ibn Battuta, right? Uh, in the 15th century, the famous Portuguese navigator, Prince Henry the Navigator. Um, for Spain, although he is not a Spaniard, we have Christopher Columbus was able to reach the New World, the Americas, in 1492. Again, for Portugal, you have Vasco da Gama, uh, who was able to reach India, uh, and Afonso de Albuquerque, who was instrumental in the fall of the Sultanate of Malacca in uh, what is now Malaysia, right? By the way, Ferdinand Magellan was part of Albuquerque's expedition to Malacca. That's the reason why he presented himself to the King of Spain as somebody who can reach, right, who is familiar with the Spice Islands of the Moluccas, uh, and he could provide his services to the Spanish kingdom, right, to allow them to allow Spain to uh, reach the islands and gain access to the lucrative spice trade. Okay. Okay. So the general context of the age of exploration is conquest and trade, right? Primarily, the Europeans were interested in the trade of the region. The most notable of which, of course, is the spice trade. But it's not. Let us just clarify that the trade of Southeast Asia is not just about spices. We also have other products that interested the Europeans. Although, of course, the most lucrative one is where the spices that were found mostly, or at least in large quantity, in the islands of the Moluccas, right? By the way, there is no Moluccas Island. Moluccas is the name the of the chain of islands. The main islands, by the way, in the Moluccas are Ternate. That's why we have a place called Ternate, Cavite, because uh, that place in Cavite became the home of Spanish conquistadores who joined the expeditionary mission to the Moluccas later in the 1500s, right? So Ternate is one of the major islands. The other one is Tidore or Tidor, right? Okay. So there is no island named Moluccas. It is the name is for the group of islands. Just like in the Philippines, there is no island called the Visayas, right? The Visayas is the collective name of a group of islands in our central Philippines. Okay? So, and conquest, obviously, was another feature of the age of exploration. Uh, the Portuguese conquered Goa, which is in India, right? And we've already mentioned conquered the uh, Sultanate of Malacca, right? And of course, the Spaniards eventually, well, not during the time of Magellan, uh, but much, much later, but they also conquered the Philippines. Okay? So that is the dual context of the age of exploration. Okay, this is just a map of world trade, world maritime trade. That needs to be emphasized, right? Maritime trade. So it's not just here in Southeast Asia, right? But this is global in scope, right? Global in scope. So that is the first thing that we need to understand, right? That this was not an isolated event. Okay. So the map is there. Actually, all of these maps that I'm showing you are available online. Just search using keywords like world trade or Southeast Asian trade, uh, and you'll be able to access all of these maps for yourself. Okay. Uh, okay. So another thing that needs to be understood here is that maritime trade is interconnected, right? It's interconnected from Europe to its connected trade with the New World, with Africa, right? With the Middle East, right? Crossing the Mediterranean, uh, as well as to India and China and Southeast Asia in between, right? Okay, so of course the major trading areas are the Middle East, India, and China, right? But we have what we call, what economic historians call secondary international commerce, right? And this is the commerce, maritime trade that happens uh, inside this region of Borneo, Philippines, and Eastern Indonesia, which is um, which is a uh, what's the word? Which is an outgrowth of the major trade routes from east to west and west to east, right? And those of you who are old enough, just like uh, Mr. Herrera and I, right? Those of you who are old enough to remember during the time of President Ramos, right? There was BIMP Iaga, right? Think it's Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, East Asia Growth Area, right? And that is very historical, right? Because it goes all the way back to the 1500s and even earlier, actually, even earlier. Okay? And all of this, let me reiterate, because our sponsor is the Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office, all of this is maritime trade, right? Or maritime-oriented trade, right? Here is another map of the interconnected nature of maritime trade in Southeast Asia as well, Asia in general, right? Asia in general, but more specifically in Southeast Asia. Um, you can see here, you can see below the Philippines, for example, the island of Ternate, right? The island of Ternate in the Moluccas, right? Okay. Again, all of these maps are available online, right? These are available online. You can get it for yourself. Okay, okay. So this is another map, right? Uh, establishing. Uh, well, you can see from the map that the words trading and raiding. I will talk about that later, right? because these are dual phenomena, right, associated with international maritime trade, right? Okay, I'll explain that later. So this is just a map that specifically focuses on the Philippines and its immediate connections, right? Its immediate connections in Southeast Asia. Okay? Huh? Why is it not moving? Yeah, okay. All right. Okay. But again, right? Again, then and now, right? China trade, our China trade is the uh, China or trade coming from China is the central. China is the central figure in this trade that involves the Philippines, right? Because aside from the spices that come from the Moluccas, uh, an important mover of international maritime trade are Chinese products, right? Chinese products like silk, like porcelain, right? Ceramics, like perfume, and others, right? So it's not just like I think I mentioned this earlier. It's not just spices that fuel this regional and international trade, right? Okay. Um, uh, if you wow. Okay. Okay. Um, I forgot to include a certain map, but uh, let's just use this map, right? Let's just use this map as an example. At the lower portion of the map, you will see the Java Sea, right? The Java Sea, as well as the Straits of Malacca. I hope everybody can see that, right? Okay. Now, the Straits of Malacca is extremely important, right? Because that is the passageway from to and from China and India, right? So Indian commerce, especially towards the 16th century, right? Especially towards the 1500s, Indian commerce headed for China usually passed through the Straits of Malacca, right? Okay. And uh, also during this time, and even earlier, right? And even earlier, they're developed in the Java Sea area, right? The uh, the kingdoms of, I'm sure you've heard of this, right? The kingdoms of Majapahit and Srivijaya, right? So in general, they developed as a powerful uh, kingdom in the Java Sea area, right? Okay. So as these kingdoms in the Java Sea area became powerful, they became a little bit uh, recalcitrant in the eyes of the Chinese Empire, right? Uh, they were now defying the wishes of the Chinese Empire, right? So uh, China decided to shift, right? Shift the focus of the Chinese trade, pivot the focus of the Chinese trade away from the Java Sea towards our region here, Borneo, the Philippines, and Eastern Indonesia, right? So that's why you have the flourishing of international maritime trade, particularly in the 16th century, in the 1500s, or uh, even in the 1400s, before the 1500s, right? Uh, so as far as the Philippine participation in this international maritime trade is concerned, our main products were clove, camphor, nutmeg, sandalwood, tortoise shells, etc. Uh, and the main market, really, of these products was China, right? And as you can see in the photo to the right? This is a news report from 2014, right? Where we uh, which talks about Chinese fishermen poaching turtles, actually tortoise, right? In our seas, right? That is not a contemporary phenomenon only, right? A Chinese demand for tortoise shells goes all the way back to 500 years ago, or even before 500 years ago, right? So a lot of things have changed in 500 years, but also a lot of things have not changed. Okay? Uh, okay. Now, in the Philippines also, right, we will see the prominence of entrepot trade, right? Okay. Well, brief explanation of entrepot trade means that certain strategic or important locations uh, become the center of entrepot trade, meaning both uh, buyers and sellers converge, right? Converge uh, in the entrepot to exchange their goods and services, right? Okay, so you have several components of this entrepot trade, right? The first one we might say is domestic, right? To the Philippines, you have the exchange between our interior areas, right? Together with our coastal communities, right? So our interior areas generally provide forest and agricultural products, which they exchange for products that uh, they will uh, they will encounter in the entrepot, usually in the coastal areas, right? So that's why you have the so-called upstream and downstream connections along bodies of water, such as uh, the Manila Bay area and the Pasig River area that flows into Laguna de Bai. So, for example, historically, you'll be able to see connections between Manila and the areas of Laguna, Cavite, Rizal, Batangas, right? That you will see, for example, during the revolution of 1896, right? Uh, the revolutionaries were formed, their organizations were formed uh, because of these existing connections between Manila and all of those provinces. All of those connections date all the way back to our international maritime trade connections. Right? Okay. So you also have inter-island or national trade. Right? So this is context for example, of uh, Cebu and Mactan, right? Inter-island trade, or even Cebu and Bohol later on during the time of Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, right? And Raja Sikatuna, right? Um, and as well as the connections of, for example, Manila with the islands of Mindoro, right? And the connections between the islands in the Sulu archipelago, and so on and so forth. There's so many examples of this, right? And it is inter-island entrepot trade that connects all of them, right? Okay. And then, of course, you have the regional and international trade. I don't think I need to talk about that because already saw that in the previous maps, right? As an example of this, in 1521, just before Magellan arrived in Cebu, a Siamese from what is now Thailand, right? We call Siam today Thailand, right? So the ship from Siam was docked in Cebu uh, for entrepot trade purposes, right? Okay. Uh, Okay, so this is extremely important because international maritime trade has a transformative effect in our social, political, economic, and even religious life, right? So, for example, uh, we became, right, in general, of course, there are exceptions like we became a trading and raiding society, right? Because we cannot avoid this, right? We cannot avoid this during in commerce, right? In the market, not all transactions, not all transactions are honorable, right? There are some transactions that try to take advantage of people, right? Deception happens in the market, right? Deception, fraud, right? And all of these negative transactions, right? So when that happens, and the Spanish accounts are very clear about this. For example, Captain Miguel de Luarca very clearly writes in his Relation that war between communities in the Philippines happens when a commercial transaction goes awry, right? Or when one party feels that they have been deceived, taken advantage of, or some kind of fraud was committed against them, right? That's why when you look at tattooing, for example, right? Tattooing uh, results from wartime valor, right? Uh, our warriors, every time they exhibit uh, valor, bravery, courage in times of war, as a result of uh, this unsavory commercial transactions, uh, they will earn their tattoos on their bodies, right? So the more tattoo you have on your body, it means that you are a very experienced and very decorated, right? Decorated warrior or leader, right? Okay. Our concept of bayani, bagani, right? Um, these are all also related to wartime experiences, right? As well as peacetime experiences. So wartime, they are warriors, right? During peacetime, they are traders, right? They are traders. Okay, so you also see the creation of specialized offices or positions in Philippine society. You have the trade officials, technology experts, right? The panday, for example, uh, that results from trade. I will explain later, right? And you also have social cultural leaders, babaylan, also related to the transformative effect of international maritime trade. Okay. Is this not moving? Sorry. Is this not? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, there's a transformation. You can also see transformation in Philippine history and culture, right? For example, in international relations. By the way, I loosely use the word international relations here because the Philippines is at this time was populated by small independent communities, right? Small independent communities. So for example, Mactan was a small independent community. Cebu is a slightly bigger community but also independent. Bohol is also an independent community and so on and so forth, right? Okay. So, in order to preserve peace, right, especially in trade, right, peaceful trade, because you want to promote peaceful trade in order to ensure prosperity for all, right? You don't want to develop a negative reputation in terms of commerce and trade because the foreign traders are not going to come back, right? And that partly explains why when Magellan's expedition first arrived in the Philippines, we gave them food, right? We gave them food. We gave them all of the hospitality that Filipinos are known for. By the way, Filipino hospitality is because of that. We want the foreigners, foreign traders to come back, right? We want them to come back and have a very profitable partnership with them, right? So that's why we want to promote peace. And peace is generally promoted through the sandugo, right? Uh, or pag-aanghod according to the historian Vicente Villan, right? It's a ritual that leaders of communities perform with each other, right? Because it's a ritual brotherhood, right? Which means that if the other community is your brother or younger brother in the case of pagkaangkot, you will not take advantage of them, right? You will not take advantage of them. You will not engage in fraudulent transactions with them, etc., etc. That is why when fraud is committed, the anger that Filipinos feel is really heightened because there's a sense of betrayal. There's a sense of uh, betrayal, a very strong kind of sense of betrayal. That's why we tend to punish them by raiding their communities as a form of punishment for those fraudulent transactions. And also, right, to recover uh, lost uh, lost transactions. That's why the purpose, if you notice in your Philippine history lessons, the purpose of the raiding is not to kill the enemies, but to take as many slaves or alipin as possible, which is again an economic transaction. You don't want to kill these people. You just want to take them home as alipin because the alipin will serve as your physical labor, right? Physical labor in your community, right? So again, it has an even slavery or sorry, it's not slavery. Alipin is economic in nature, right? Okay, so you have uh, the economics of prestige goods. That is how social hierarchy is determined. The social hierarchy is determined in one way, right? There are other ways, but in one way, it is determined by your ownership of certain prestige goods. And these are mostly luxury goods from China, right? Umbrellas, silk clothing, right? Necklaces, right? And other luxury items, right? But another component of international maritime trade is the security component, right? Because in general, Philippine communities buy from the Chinese or foreigners in particular, we buy metals from them in exchange for our Philippine products because we will forge the metals. And please remember Panday Pira here, the Panday. We will forge these metals into cannons, into spears, into blades, right? For the security of the community, right? So international maritime trade is very transformative, right? It transformed all aspects of our community. Okay, so in the Battle of Mactan itself, right, you will see the one side of this international maritime trade, which is, of course, there is cooperation in the pag-anghod and sandugo, but there is also rivalry, right? There's also rivalry because a leader's responsibility, primary responsibility, is to their community, right? So in some cases, you want to monopolize trade, right? In order to monopolize all of the benefits for the good of your community, right? So in that sense, Raja Humabon and uh, and uh, Lapu-Lapu were also rivals. They're also rivals because they are neighboring communities and neighboring entrepot, engaged in the same activities, right? So they are rivals. That's why, sorry, and the context here is the dynamics of Philippine politics, which is all of these communities have a horizontal relationship with each other. No community is superior or above the other communities. That's why the arrival of Magellan was a little bit unsettling, right? It was a little bit unsettling because Magellan tried to promote Humabon as the superior of all of the other Rajas and Datu in the region, which did not sit well with Lapu-Lapu, right? Because Lapu-Lapu and Humabon are equals, and he did not appreciate the fact that Magellan promoted Humabon. Okay? Magellan attempted to change the political and social landscape by offering Spanish overlordship to Humabon, make him the first, right? So, and obviously, Magellan also wanted to engage in personal aggrandizement, right? That is at least the theory of the Spaniard Jorge Mojarro, right? The quotation in Mojarro's essay article is there on the right side, right? Now, but the truth of the matter here is the Battle of Mactan happened because Humabon manipulated Magellan. Humabon made Magellan believe that Lapu-Lapu was recalcitrant, that Lapu-Lapu to uh, refused to recognize the power configuration that Magellan was introducing to Cebu, right? That's why Magellan felt compelled uh, to show uh, to the Cebuanos the power of the Spanish military, right? Because Magellan wanted Spanish overlordship over the Cebuanos. And the Cebuanos were thinking, okay, please prove to us your power, right? And Humabon thought of it as a convenient way to get rid of one of his rivals who did not want to recognize his new position in the new political configuration, right? So Magellan was manipulated into attacking Mactan and Lapu-Lapu, right? By the very cunning Humabon. Raja Humabon was extremely cunning, right? Okay. So, so the Battle of Mactan, right? We have to clarify certain misconceptions here, right? Lapu-Lapu was not totally against the Spaniards. He was only against Magellan's promotion of Humabon. So the rivalry here is between Lapu-Lapu and Humabon. Lapu-Lapu himself also wanted to engage in Spanish trade, right? And because the Spaniards attacked Mactan, he was forced to adopt a defensive position, right? And for those of us who are familiar with the Battle of Mactan, Lapu-Lapu displayed his knowledge, deep knowledge of military strategy, right? Very briefly, if I still have time, sorry if I consumed a lot of time. The strategy of Lapu-Lapu was to bring a small force to confront Magellan at the outset, right? So Magellan and the Spaniards easily defeated that smaller force. So the smaller force appeared to have lost and was running away from the battle. In fact, they were luring Magellan into the interior of Mactan, where two large forces were hiding to ambush and to outflank Magellan. So when Magellan decided, sorry, uh, I'm about to finish, right? I'm about to finish, sorry. When Magellan decided to pursue the fleeing warriors of Mactan, they were ambushed and eventually killed, right? So Magellan's death is a product of hubris and a lack of military intelligence and personal aggrandizement. I think this is the last slide, right? I think that's the last slide. So thank you very much. Later on, I think there's an open forum. I'll be open for questions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Ibiernas, for that insightful and colorful presentation. For the second presentation of the webinar, I have the honor to introduce to you this morning the pioneer maritime anthropologist in the Philippines to give her presentation on the Pangayaw fisherwoman's gendered experience. Dr. Cynthia Neri Zayas is currently a professorial lecturer at the University of the Philippines Center for International Studies and was previously its director. She was also former chair of the Philippine Social Science Council. With her academic background from the University of the Philippines and Tsukuba University in Japan, Dr. Zayas is a known maritime anthropologist and has published renowned works on indigenous fishing and maritime cultures in the Philippines, Japan, and the Pacific Islands, among others. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, we will present to you Dr. Cynthia Neri Zayas.
Oh, thank you very much, John Francis Herrera. Um, Thank you to the Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office. Um, and it would be really good that you have this webinar because the UN, this is the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development, from 2021 to 2030. And I hope you continue this interest in culture and society of the Filipinos, its Southeast Asian neighbor, and the Pacific. You asked me to look for the Filipina in prehistoric, pre-Hispanic Philippines. What we find, however, are relaciones, and these were very exciting descriptions of ladies, bejeweled ladies, binukot, very fair ladies of the upper class. Later on, we learned that the women of the Visayas, especially were portrayed as witches, bailanes, sorcerers, healers, in other words, negative images. So that encounter really surprised many relaciones from the Western eyes. Okay, um, next slide, please. Uh, I have a big uh, title here, Encounters, History, and Geography. What I wanted to say is that I want to integrate these encounters, the history that produced it, the geography, the setting of a very micro example of contemporary island fisher women's lives that is moving with the wind. Okay, so we have this encounters, the history of it, the geography, which talks about the wind, the food, and the women fishers. Then we go into the micro study, which I have done, 30 years ago. Was it? Yeah, about that time. Next, please. So I want to read something to you. And this I got trying to find out that Filipina you wanted me to talk about. So I checked one epic. This is the book by Elena Maquiso, Olahingon. Livuganon Arumanon Manobos from North Cotabato. Let me read this description. This is Sang, and this is an English translation. Notice that this is about a description of the hero's sisters. No? Okay. Now, notice the graceful way of waists, rhythmic movement of the hips, as tender as the ganda, as gentle as the lansuna. They can be encircled by the fingers, rounded by the tips of the hand, as tiny as the middle finger, the graceful waist they render. So, so beautiful transcription, uh, description. That lasuna, by the way, is a shallot. Here you can see it in the right. This is shallot. And lansuna is the regular onion. I don't know why this metaphor was used. Anyway, that is what the epic would tell us. Next, please. Now, in the encounters of 1521 or so, we have this description, no? And this is what apparently Magellan and his men saw about the women. From the Magellan, from De Magellan saw gold earrings, armbands, and spear decorations in Homonhon. Spaniards kept reporting gold jewelry in truly astonishing quantities. They were struck not by its amount and wide distribution, but by the fact that it appeared to be part of a normal attire. of persons otherwise almost naked. A Dato by the name of Iberiin was rowed out of Spanish vessel anchored in his harbor in 1543 by oarsmen colored with gold. So don't you realize that even if we wash our clothes, we wear diamond ring or our golden ring, we don't remove it, no? So kahit itong mga nagpapadol ng bangka, ay merong golden necklace, no? It's part of the attire. And that's the way they were in that period. Next, please. Okay, so we have these several uh, illustrations of Boxer Codex and very intricate gold refining, very refined gold jewelries, in fact. And if you have been to the Ayala Museum, if you have not been to the Ayala Museum, please go visit the upper floor. And we have, this is a catalog of that book, The Philippine Ancestral Gold. And you can find fantastic jewelries there. So you have a Boxer Codex photograph here, an illustration here, a Visayan couple wearing fine ornaments with gold arm and leg bangles and ear ornaments similar to Alcina's description. Well, Alcina was the other guy who has who has described the Visayas very articulately, and among the ethnographies of Relaciones, this is the most comprehensive and detailed in a way that we are able to picture that 16th century life in the Philippines. Next, please. Can we have the next slide? Okay, here is Alcina. Women are generally lighter than men. In fact, Alcina said, mas matangkad daw yung mga Bisaya kaysa Tagalog at saka mas fairer daw, ano? Due to occupations like weaving, which kept them less exposed to the sun. Weaving was a normal part of housekeeping. They did pottery as well. The women ordinarily are much more fair in complexion, particularly those who live in great distance from the coastline, and even more especially the principals, who are called binokot. This is a very important keyword because we still have binokot, especially in the mountains of Panay, among the Bukidnons of Panay. And there's still women that are really well protected and just stayed home. Uh, that they happen to belong to the upper class. No? Okay. Visayan women are accustomed to wear a lot of gold about their necks, on their wrists, and rings on their fingers. They also wear necklaces in the fashion of the Spaniards in the style of antiquity. Now, this one is from the oral traditions. No? Alcinous was saying, heroines are royal princesses, as inaccessible binokot. So even in their stories, in their oral tradition, they talk about this binokot in their chambers, where they are found spinning, weaving, or embroidering with their princess clothes. So yun ang papel ng mga babae. Yun ang nakita nung panahon na yon. Let's remember that different periods have different concerns, have different eyes and different people's eyes. Okay, now let's go to the next slide, please. Now let's look at Luarca's Relaciones de las Islas Filipinas. Natives are not acquainted with the art of writing. They present their ancient lore through songs. That is the oral tradition that they were singing, no? Which they see in a very pleasing manner, commonly while plying their oars as they are island dwellers. So habang nagsasagwan, kumakanta. And sa pagkantang yon, kumakanta sila ng mga epiko. the exploits of their ancestors. Also, during revelries, the singers who have good voices recite the exploits of olden times. Yeah, that's it, no? And we still have that ulahingon that I was telling you. That is an example of an epic. Now, so we were trying to relate the past and the present that we have. So, because I'm just telling you that it's possible, no, to find out in many ways what this Filipina we're looking for, no. We can find that in the binukod, in the bejeweled women, in our epics or our archaeological finds. Now, Luarcas was saying that in one of the gods, no, they believe that the god Magwayan carried the souls of his disciples in his boat to another life. No? And we found that out in the Manungul jar of the Tabon Caves. Very old, 2,000 years old. Is it 2,000? There, we have that evidence. Uh, so we can check, we can check what was said before, and now that we have some evidence. Next, please. Next slide, please. Now, this is what I was trying to say. That we still have, this is a Tiboli, very contemporary Tiboli, very, very intricate. Very intricate clothes. Tingnan mo, saan siya pupunta mamamalengke? Mamamalengke. It's not even a festival. It's an everyday wear. So, it was important that we have that kind of description too. No? But we don't get the maritime women, the fisher women. But I'm telling you that even they are not fisher women, they are maritime people too. Next, please. Slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, now let's see the context. Uh-oh. Let's see the context of these relaciones and these epic descriptions, this contemporary evidence in archaeology and ethnography. Let's look at this from the point of view of the wind, the food, and the women fishers. No? Amihan and Habagat are two important seasons that rule the lives of people of the sea, the maritime people. No? So, Amihan, you have from January, it was blowing from the mainland continental Asia going to us. No? So it's the wind from the east going to the west. Then that's about January, no, on or before or after, no. Then you have the habagat, which will be blowing again, this time the other way, from the west to the east. And this wind dictates where will be the next fishing grounds of the fishers of Visayas. I'm talking about the artisanal fishers, the small scale fishers. Okay, not talking about commercial fisheries, but these are fisher folks now. And you see here, this is a man of war in the period of Magellan, or way before Magellan, in fact. These were used as a trading boat or a raiding boat sometimes. And in contemporary Philippines, you have the kubo, abajao, houseboat, and this would also travel. No? Okay, next please. Now, I want to tell you about the food, the importance of fish in our diet. Because I talk about this wind and how fishing is ruled by the movement of this wind. No? Now, I want to tell you that fish, it's very obvious that fish is an important protein in our diet as maritime peoples. No? This is a model of our food We have kanin plus ulam. That's basic. But if there would sometimes be sausawan. Uh, Now, I want to talk about ulam. When you look at the concept of ulam, no, I want to use the word fish, fish, because fish is ulam. Now, let's look at the next slide. Okay, these are some ethno-linguistic groups with the word for the word that has fish. Okay, Itawis isinay isra means ulam to them. Kaliga bontok is cha. Ibig sabihin ng karne, no? For Ilocano, sida. That means ulam. And you have Tagalog, waray Cebuano tauso, Aklanon buhid mangyan, Birak Bicol, Naga Bicol, Tagbanwa, then Bukidnon, Maranao, Subanon. Isda is fish. So if you look at on your right, the Cordillera and the Ilocos region, you have this isda, shida as ulam, huh? As ulam, and fish is fish in these areas. So that what I just want to use this as a heuristic device to say how important fish is in our culture. Without ulam, kanin, kanin can be grains, kanin can be breadfruit, can be ube, gabi, kamote, blunt, no, very bland. But with an ulam, it's so delicious. No? That's why we cannot live without ulam. Kahit asin. No? Okay. So that is how important fish is to our lives. Okay, next please. Can we have the next slide? Now let's look at in contemporary lives, women in fisheries. What do they do? No? This is in Lian, Batangas. Panghihinas, no? Pangunguha ng shell. Pag low tide, if you have a long tide of flats, uh, most, most, most probably and surely you will find, aha, hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hello?
ma'am, we can hear you. We can hear
Yeah,
you.
I have I have an unstable internet connection. This is not the fault of DFA, but this is the fault of PLDT. Hmm? Okay, now just tell me because I'm going to stop. So now we are on. I go back to women in fisheries, Panghinas in Lian Batangas. If you have long tidal floods, surely you will have get a lot of these clams. No, and this is the job of women and children. This can be used as ulam. This can be used as ulam or can be sold with neighbors or maybe it can go to market directly. Next, please. Besides this, okay, see this. These are sea cucumber. The native name is bat or balat. No, very expensive sea cucumber. Chinese love this. This is women and children. See, women is always associated with children, probably because they take care of the children. So they bring them along to clean, to process. It's a long way to process a sea cucumber. You clean, you dry, you smoke, no, many days. Okay, and pamakas, no, drying fish. You see this woman still cleaning that fish. It will be soaked. After cleaning, it will be soaked in brine. Then they dry. Then they turn it around. And then next, it's a tedious work. But the most tedious work of all is putting baits, especially on a long line. No? You have what 3,000 baits to put in one line, in one line, and you you you're putting this for probably your man to fish. But after he comes home, you have to remove the hook, and then straighten the line, then put it again. This is a tedious work, and you have to hurry because you have to do it the following day. Yan ang pinakamahirap, I think. Next, please. Yeah, there are other ways that women involve themselves in the isda that we love to eat. They sell in the market. No? After they process, they sell. They can do tinapa, they can do pinakas. Then they sell fresh fish. They clean the fish. No? Why them? Why around this time, their husbands might be asleep already. And this is the time they go to the market or the tiangge or yeah, and sell this produce that their husbands or they must have procured from a neighbor if they have enough capital to be a middle person, process the fish and sell or sell it fresh this way. Okay, next please. Of course, they cook the best food. They know how to cook. They know how to cook exactly the food that the fish, the sea, the produce from the sea. They're just fantastic, you know, the food that they are. Next time you're in Tacloban, go to Yolanda restaurant. It's very near the airport. And turu turu, and they cook it for you. This is from Yolanda. Fantastic food. Okay, next please. Yeah, and women are very important in the ritual of Thanksgiving for healing as well. And they play an important role in producing the offerings, in reciting the oraciones for safe at sea and bountiful harvest in the next season. In the next season, this is a samba rite in Antique uh, on New Year's Eve. They're sending the old spirits and welcoming the new one by offering all kinds of food without salt. This is the irony of it, without salt. Okay, so that is in a capsule what women do in our time. What women do in our time. We notice them. We're no longer the Westerners who are seeing them for the first time. We are now guided by our eyes. We realize the importance of their role in this chain, no, of food production. Of course, there are women who go fish with a husband. No? They go fish, they dive, uh, they dive for sea cucumber, they dive for shells, they even go spear diving, you know, and they join the men, throw the net as well. But in the olden times, women, there's a taboo because women menstruate and they are they can be malas in the boat. No, but this has changed. Of course, our technology changed. We now use engine. Our boats have engine, and we have sophisticated fishing gears. We use lights for fishing, and since we don't have anybody to assist us in fishing, we ask probably our wives, our children to come along. Huh? Now, I want to tell you this story of how this Amihan and Abagat has brought about fisher folks of one small island to the other island to fish. No? This is, I think, the template of the Baranganic society that we have established in the Philippines. No? And this is what transformed the meaning of pangayaw that Professor Ibieres said was form of raiding, slave raiding, no, for manpower, the needs of manpower of a bangsa or a polity. No? Okay, so very briefly, I will go. Can we go to the next slide, please? Now, I want to read you this. What is the importance of the Visayas? Here, uh, you can read it with me there. In the central Philippines lie scattered islands collectively known as the Visayas. Surrounded by the Visayan Sea, the most productive fishing ground in the country. This area has more small-scale fishers than any other region of the country. Fisheries vary, but small-scale fishing continues to form a significant portion of the total fish catch. The vagaries of weather are an enduring problem for the fishers. Indeed, response to the monsoon winds have shaped the lifestyle among the Pangayaw. The term Pangayaw suggests people moving from place to place to see what gain there is in the adventure. It is a name given to outsiders who gain some something by undertaking livelihood activities in the area. Gigantes has a long history of migration because the Gigantes Island, you can find it here. Can you see the cursor? This is Iloilo and Estancia is here. It's just a small island here. Okay, very tiny. Now, it's a tourist destination. No? So, my story is about there are several islands here too, no? Tiny islands. This extended family who would cross the Visayan Sea and go to Gigantes annually in the summer season. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, how do they do it? It's when it's Amihan time, they wait for the period when there is no longer typhoon. Sometimes we have typhoon during Amihan, no? Freak typhoons, no? So they go as tabid. Now, tabid means to tie one another. So you have a pump boat here. This has engine. No? Then you have tiny sakayan. These are called sakayan. They have no engine. They can use a sail or they can row. But since they are pulled by the powerful pump boat, this is less than a ton, by the way. The bigger one probably is a ton, but this is less than a ton, no? And maybe 12 horsepower up. So you have this tied one after another, and you are pulled. And what is interesting about this group of people is you can see gender how gender plays a role in the various activities that the fishing entail in this tabid seikatsu, tabid lifestyle. I'm speaking Japanese now. Okay, so remember this image. I don't know, this was 30 years ago. I don't know, but about 20 years ago, we can still see this in the Visayan Sea. Okay, so can we go to the next slide, please? Now, that? What comprised that tabid? No, you have sakayan. Sakayan are the small boats. No, these are owned by four people, two female and two male. Binbin and Arsenio are brothers. Nerissa and Balina, I think, daughters and niece. Okay, I'll show you the family structure in a while. Now you saw those little boats, they're called tabid pairs, and each of those boats has two crew. No? Okay, now we have one, two, three, four, five, six, seven. There we have eight pairs. In other words, there are eight sakayan there. Okay, these sakayan are owned by these four people. Apparently, these fishers, they're fishers, those inside the sakayan, are share in agriculture, you call them sharecropper. This one is the share catch. That's how they're paid. Then you have pamakas, the one that rides the fish processors, no? And then you look at this one, you have two women and a man. This is a family. Baka to save on labor, husband side now joins in processing the fish. Para pamaon, the baits, because they are using long line, no? The baits are these young girls, no? Young girls. Okay. These tabid crews are simply young men, single young men. No? They age from 15 to 20. These para pamaon, the ones that put the bait, are girls ages from, oh, they're teenagers, 14 to 18. No? And because there are about marriageable ages, some social relations occur when they visit the island. Siyempre, nagkakaroon ng crush doon sa local girls or local boys. And in the end, they come back and marry or they stay for good. No? So the two, okay, uh, okay, I think I have written that about here. So can you imagine? No? Can we go back to the last slide, please? The, the previous one. So this is owned by one of the Sakayan owners, no? And these are the young men and the girls, the teenagers, and the boat owners are in the pump boat. Okay, next slide, please. Um, what happens is that why have this group of extended family and neighbors traveled to Gigantes? Previous summers, they have gone as well. And it happened that Binbin's or Arsenio's here, Arsenio's daughter had married one resident there. And this resident now has a shed we call bodega, can be bodega, where they store the fishing ground. And that's where they stay for the duration of the summer. No? That's where they sleep. No? Now, since the daughter of Arsenio has married to the islander, they have now become the comprador of the catch, and the processed fish of these group of Tabid, this Tabid group, the sea caravan. No? That is how relationship occur. Uh, so they can dictate the price. How much is the fresh fish? How much is the dried fish? And of course, it's not it's not all that way. They are neighbors are given a share of the catch. This is the way in maritime society. Neighbors are given at least pangulam, no? Especially close to you and relatives of the comprador or relatives of neighbors. Because when you're neighbors, you're almost like relatives. No? And this sharing is very important. One form of how we store our goods, extend its life by having a return in the future when the neighbor has extra as well. No? That is the life there in that island. And this is one example of Tabid life. Um, so that everybody could have a job. Everybody could have a job, and uh, definitely it's gendered roles that there is. It can be interchangeable at times. It's not very strict, but ideally, para pamaon and pamakas would be for women. These are detailed work. It's like embroidery and weaving. You think men have patience? Men would have patience to do weaving and embroidery? No. Women would have that. So it is like putting baits and processing, no? Dried fish, doing pamakas. Okay, next please. Well, this is the whole group. Maybe it's very complicated. This is male, this is female. These are the owners of those sakayan. For 1, 2, 3, 4. What is the E? Tabid bears. These are the tabid bears. The one inside the sakayan. No? There. And this is how related. I'm just showing you, you don't have to understand it, but I'm just showing you that kind of relationship. And those fishing crews are not really related to them, but probably neighbors. Some are uh, agriculturists, no? They're sharecroppers. They would come to the shore and look for part-time job. Since in summer there's no agriculture, they wait until the rain comes, so they do this part-time. Okay. Uh, yeah. This is how it is, and my theory is that this is how we made our barangganic society, and we expanded and expanded and expanded. When we find the right fishing ground, we decide to stay. No? We decide to stay. Okay. We're still looking for those women, but this is the period when me and my co-scholars have now the eyes to see the importance of women in the fishing, in the fisheries as an industry, especially on artisanal fisheries. Now you will see them here. Next, please. This is Linbin's family, extended family, about 30 years ago. Yeah, I began my study in that island 30 years ago, and I've gone there every now and then. Yeah. Now I find the women, the the ladies, the girls in our in the productive aspect of our economy in these artisanal fishers. You find them very, very clearly because their labor is very important as well as the men's labor. How, imagine you have no refrigeration. How can you prolong the life of the fish? You need processors. How long can you fish the following day if you have no baits? People to put the baits on the long line. It's not a mechanical activity. No, it's a family, it's a neighborhood, it's a group tabid activity that would make it possible for us to have this delicious bulao from Iloilo. You know? Yeah, now let's see now this another ice from two professors I love so much, my teacher, my friends, uh, and they will tell us where they are. these women that we're looking for. Can we play that? Next, please.
Kayo ba ang mga Maria Clara, mga huli at mga sisa, na di marunong na lumaban? Kaapihay, bakit iniluluha? Mga babae, kayo ba'y sadyang mahina? Kayo ba ang mga Cinderella, na lalaki ang tanging pag-asa? Kayo nga ba ang mga nena, nahanap buhay ang pagpuputa? Mga babae, kayo ba'y sadyang pangkama? Ang ating isip ay buksan at lipunay pag-aralan. Paano nahubog inyong isipan at tanggapin kayo'y mga libangan? Mga babae, ito nga ba'y kapalaran? Bakit ba mayroong mga Gabriela, mga Teresa at tandang Sora, na di umasa sa luhat awa? Sila'y nagsipag hawak ng sandata, nakikilaban, ang mitin ay lumaya. Bakit ba mayroong mga Lisa, mga Liliosa at mga Lorena, na di natakot makibaka, at ngayoy marami ang kasama? Mga babae, ang mitin ay lumaya. Ang ating isip ay buksan at lipunay pag-aralan. Paano nahubog inyong isipan at tanggapin kayo'y mga libangan? Mga babae, ito nga ba'y kapalaran? Bakit ba mayroong mga Lisa, mga Liliosa at mga Lorena, na di natakot makibaka, at ngayoy marami ang kasama? Mga babae, ang mitin ay lumaya. Mga babae, ang mitin ay lumaya.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zayas, for that equally insightful and eye-opening presentation. The virtual floor is now open for questions. For those who wish to ask a question, you have the following options to do so. You may use the raise hand feature of the Zoom platform and wait to be acknowledged. After you are acknowledged, your camera and microphone feature will become operational, and you may directly address your question to either one of the speakers or both. The other option is to send a question via the chat feature of the Zoom platform. We request that you identify yourself and which agency, university, school, or other entity you represent before asking your question. The floor is now open. While we're waiting for other questions, we actually have several questions set in for actually, these questions are meant for Professor Ibiernas. I'll read them for you. The first question is, what were the circumstances that led to Magellan's arrival in Cebu? Although you mentioned that international maritime trade was prevalent during the early 16th century, it seems that Magellan and his men were the first Europeans to arrive in Cebu, as you mentioned that the latter traded with the Chinese and Siamese earlier. How did the Cebuanos initially react to Magellan's arrival, and how did Magellan convince Humabon to recognize the Spanish king? Maybe we can address that question first.
Yeah. Well, the circumstances of Magellan's expedition were basically they were in search of a westward route to the Spice Islands, right? Um, because upon the impact of uh, Christopher Columbus's discovery of the Americas, uh, opened the floodgates for European exploration, right? So there was exploration on the part of the Portuguese, mostly in parts of Africa and all the way to India on the one hand, and the exploration of the Spaniards into the Americas, right? So there was an agreement mediated by Pope Alexander VI. No? But that mediation by Pope Alexander VI did not have legal weight, right? The papal bull of 1493 did not have any legal weight. The one that had legal weight was the Treaty of Tordesillas. Treaty of Tordesillas that was signed by Spain and Portugal in 1494, where they essentially divided the world. I think people are fairly familiar with this, right? So, in essence, the Western sphere belonged to the Spanish sphere of influence. The Eastern sphere belonged to the Portuguese. Now, of course, other European powers did not recognize this. No, the English did not recognize this. The French did not recognize this. This was essentially just between the Portuguese and the Spanish. So Magellan wanted to reach Moluccas by traveling westward because the Western sphere belonged to Spain. Okay. Now, the second question: how did the Cebuanos react to the arrival of the Spaniards? Actually, not just the Cebuanos, but the people of the Philippine archipelago were not surprised with the arrival of the Europeans, right? Because, like I said, there were a lot of foreigners, right? Foreign traders, foreign ships that regularly visited certain portions of the Philippine archipelago, right? So it was not really a surprise, right? It was not a surprise. And people of our archipelago assume that the purpose of uh, the Europeans in coming here was to trade, right? So that's the reason why when Magellan arrived in Cebu, uh, Raja Humabon wanted to collect uh, a, a payment, wanted to collect payment from the Spaniards for their participation in the entrepot trade in Cebu, right? Of course, Magellan refused to pay, right? Refused to pay primarily because he considered it an insult that he had to pay for the right to dock in Cebu, right? But Magellan was also faced with a dilemma, right? Because he needed uh, the people of Cebu. He needed supplies. He needed uh, he needed time, right? Time, because you have to understand, Magellan and his crew had been traveling for many months, right? A lot of them were sick. Most of them were malnourished, right? So they needed Cebu, right? So I think that's the reason why Magellan was forced, right? Magellan was forced to introduce the idea of Spanish overlordship to the Cebuanos in exchange for being allowed to stay in Cebu. Because I mean, um, the longer Magellan stayed in, not just in Cebu but in our islands, the longer Magellan stayed in our islands, the more that our people realized that they were useless. They were useless. They did not have any valuable items for trade because they refused to sell their cannons to us. They refused to sell their cannons to us. So they really had nothing of value to trade to Filipinos. So I think that's the reason why, and this is speculation, of course, on my part, right? But I think that's the reason why Magellan offered uh, an alliance between Spain and Raja Humabon. Now, of course, later on, when Legazpi returned to the Philippines 40 years later, Legazpi would disavow Magellan and said that, Magellan was not authorized to do this, do that. That was not the instruction of King Charles, etc., etc. Right? So, and that's probably correct. And that's probably correct because Magellan was not authorized to enter into any agreement with uh, with the people of Cebu. But I think if you read the situation, the context is Magellan had to do something. Magellan had to do something because he had nothing to offer. He had nothing to offer the Filipinos, right? And the Filipino conversion to Christianity is understood using that context, right? When Magellan offered an alliance between Spain and Humabon's Cebu, that's when uh, the people of Cebu, led by Humabon and his wife, began to warm up to the idea of that they need to convert to Christianity as a sort of ritual to seal that partnership, right? Okay. So your third question, I forgot. I can you refresh my memory, sir, about the third question?
Yes, I'll read it for you again, Professor. So the third question that was being asked is uh, well, actually, that was pretty much it.
Okay.
How did Magellan convince Humabon to recognize the Spanish king?
Okay. Okay.
Yes. If I may, I'd like to ask a question for Professor Zayas. So you thank you very much for the presentation. You made mention that um, uh, as part of your studies, you visited these fishing communities and even spent time with one specific family. And also you mentioned that you've regularly visited them before, or I believe you still continue to visit them. How has the impact of the modernization of a society affected them and their livelihood? Given the technology that we have nowadays, do you feel that this has benefited them, or do you think that it has led to a decrease in their activities as fisher folk? I'd like to ask your views on this, ma'am. Thank you.
Excuse me, my internet was unstable. Can you restate your question briefly?
Yes, ma'am. I was asking about the families, the fisher families that you visited and then continue to visit as part of your studies. Have you noticed any impact that current technology and the
Uh,
developments in the world have? I think what I'll do,
I,
I'll just message you the question, so you
go,
can see.
go, go, go ahead. Ask me
Okay.
fast.
Yes. Regarding the Fisher families, you visited them on a regular basis. Have you noticed any impact that technology and present day developments have had on their livelihood and the way they live? Has it benefited them or has it been detrimental to their fishing activities? Thank you, ma'am.
Uh, there, there are uh, fishermen who are able to borrow money to buy engine. So they are no longer in that sakayan mode, but they can be independent fisher with a pump boat. So need not join that group. You see, from from uh, from a laborer, a maritime labor, you become like a boat owner. Pero may utang. You know, there's a system of capital that's available. Hindi to Bombay. Ewan ko kung yung Bombay, iba yung pinapasukan ng Bombay. The Chinese in Cebu, pinauutang ka ng machine, engine. Okay? And ang pangbayad mo doon is like motor kontra uga, dried fish. You can pay your utang, your engine, with a dried fish. Or a comprador can lend you money to build your boat. No? To build your boat. Babayaran mo siya ng catch mo. Pero siya magsasabi sa'yo kung magkano per kilo. It's not the market price. There is no interest. But be sure that you give part of your catch to yung pinagkakautangan mo. It's possible to do that. It's happening. No? Now, the big problem is, I think it's something has there's a climate change, and the fisheries productivity has decreased, and sometimes it gave another form of livelihood like diving for shells. No? Diving for shells, or now there are more squid. No, when the temperature increases, no, the water temperature increases, nagbabago rin yung movement ng isda. These are pelagic fishes they're catching. No? Yung nagmamigrate na isda. Ngayon, uh, nagbabago yung current no? Nagbabago rin yung itaas na tubig, yung ibaba ng tubig, nagbabago yung temperature, naapektuhan ang movement din ng isda. So they can change gears naman, no? And siguradong merong lenders dyan Remember, Panay, Iloilo is one of the biggest dried fish market. Ang pinakamalaki is Cebu, no? Uh, Nagko-compete sila May financier din sa Panay in Iloilo. There's a financier in Cebu. There's a financier in Panay as well. So, if you are a good fisher, you can pay. No? Pero siguro, isang tuka din yung buhay. No? So long as the government does not support the artisanal fishers. No? What kind of support do they need? Gears, and then seeding the sea, some regulations on fishing, and most especially cold storage. With that, you can play with the market, no? So, walang suporta Bahala ka sa buhay mo. Ano? Did I answer you?
Yes, Professor Sayas, thank you very much for your reply. I'd like to say that we're taking note of your comments, and we do agree that our fisher folk need this extra help, especially with regard to the provisions of equipment and facilities for cold storage. Thank you very much, Professor.
I just want to add something. No?
Yes, ma'am.
When we were doing a study in Masinloc, with the problem of the Bajo de Masinloc. So the fishers told us that they are unable. No, this is I don't remember, 206. I don't remember anymore. This before that conflict, no? Yung hindi na sila pinapapasok sa Baho de Masinloc. And a few months later, when we returned, sabi ng mga, oh, ano, kamusta na kayo? Nakakapangisda? Hindi na, mami. You know what happened to the women? They started to become OFW. Nag-apply na sila. No? Nag-OFW na sila. Anong ipaprocess nila? So, yung ibang fishermen, naging tricycle driver, o kaya naging construction worker, construction hand, no? Yun. So, yun yung isang dito sa Zambales, this is what had happened. By the way, these fishers of the Baho de Masinloc are the Bisaya of Cebu who traveled on a tabid in the 70s. And they established a community in Masinloc. They call that the Bisaya, the barangay ng mga Bisaya. That is the model I was telling you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, very much for your reply. I think we still have time for a few more questions. We have one more question here. It's also addressed to Professor Ibiernas. And the question is from Sultan Aquino. And the question is, sir, do we have historical records of our country's maritime trade or linkage with other countries, including the Europeans, prior to 1400, specifically during the time of the Sultanate of Sulu?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, the most famous one, obviously, was the tributary missions, right? I think that is what he's referring to. The tributary missions of Sulu to the Emperor of China, right? Again, this is extremely important, and you have to take into consideration the context, right? China was at that time our most important and biggest trading partner, right? So most of our exports were bought by traders, either Chinese traders or intermediaries who eventually will sell these products to China, right? So I think the purpose of the Sulu tributary missions to China was essentially to solidify the political relations, as well political and commercial relations between Sulu and China, right? But I think the emphasis really was on commercial relations, right? Primarily because I think I mentioned this in the presentation, right? That the Philippines, because of the archipelagic nature of our country, the Philippines is littered, right? We are littered with entrepôts. There are so many of them, right? There's so many of them, and we pretty much have similar products to sell to the Chinese, pretty much, right? So I think it was important for Sulu to establish diplomatic and political, direct political and diplomatic relations with China to solidify economic relations. I think our hardworking men and women of the Department of Foreign Affairs, I think, understand this pretty well, right? That diplomacy uh, is incredibly related to economic relations and vice versa, right? So yes, the answer to that question is yes, right? But that is more of the exception rather than the norm, precisely because commercially at that time we were not an important market for China, right? We were not really that important uh, because we mostly traded in what might be considered exotic goods, uh, bird's nest, beeswax. There were even reports of parrots being exported to China, pearls. No? So these are things uh, that belong to a niche market, right? They belong to a niche market. It's not really something. It's not really something that uh, a profitable and long-term economic commercial relations stand on, no? Because the demand for this product is highly volatile. It's a very highly volatile. It's a very highly volatile market. It's a niche market. No? So I think that was our problem, right? That is why the Philippines was at most, right, at most a secondary uh, uh, secondary market. It might even be tertiary market. We were not that. We were not that. I hate to admit it, but we are not that important, right? We were not that important, but we did participate. Right? We did participate in that international maritime trade, right? So it was not enough to entice strong diplomatic relations with other countries. Now, um, uh, there were, of course, there were migrants, right? Migrants, both from the Philippines going to other countries, particularly in our neighboring Southeast Asian countries, as well as people from outside of the Philippines settling in our islands. Of course, the most famous ones are Sultan Abu Bakar of Sulu, as well as Sharif Kabungsuan in the Mindanao, Maguindanao area, right? So these went both ways, right? There were also reports of people from Luzon, right? The Lusoes, right? Uh, they were noted by the Portuguese Tommy Pires in his uh, in his accounts. So, and this is consistent with what Dr. Zayas is saying about the uh, uh, characteristics, the nature of Filipinos as travelers, as sojourners, as people who were uh, moving to different places in search of better opportunities or new opportunities. It might not even be necessarily better, right? So, and that also explains the OFW phenomenon today. Filipinos have that, it's part of our culture to travel, to look for opportunities outside uh, of our communities, right? So yes, we have that, but we have to be careful when we look at those, and try not to put too much importance. Try to put, well, of course, Sulu wanted to put a lot of importance in the tributary missions to China, but I mean, let's face it, uh, we were not that important. We were not that important to China. I mean, not as important as Borneo, for example, or not as important as the kingdoms in the Java Sea, not as important as the as Champa in what is now Vietnam, not as important as the other Southeast Asian kingdoms. Right?
Thank you very much, Professor, for your very insightful views on the questions in response to the questions. We're actually out of time, but there are two more questions that I actually there's a lot of questions coming in, but there are two questions that I selected because I felt that they are I'm sorry if I can't accommodate the other questions, but they are quite important the way I see it. One is addressed to Professor Zayas, while the other I believe could be addressed by either one of the professors, whoever would like to give it a crack. So the first one I wish to read is addressed to Professor Zayas. It goes, the question is, women's role in fisheries sector was discussed earlier. Is there a methodology to assess their participation, which appears to be limited to fish processing and marketing, vis-a-vis men's role in fishing harvesting? How do we empower women in ocean-based livelihoods? For example, in their contribution to the sustainable development efforts. And then just to read the other questions and put it out there, the other question is, what about the role of Hindu Buddhist influences derived from Sri
Srivijaya,
Java? Yes,
Srivijaya,
Majapahit,
Mahapahit
Majapahit.
and Champa
Majapahit.
kingdoms, yes, during the time of European contact. As we understand it, Indian influences were rife, but have somehow been understated or overlooked in our history.
Uh,
Please, professors.
yeah, can I just answer? The question addressed to me is what should be the role of women in fisheries development? Is that it?
Yes, and how can we empower women in ocean-based livelihoods? For example, in their contribution to the sustainable development efforts.
I think I saw several projects of the US aid and Philippine government. This is about the coastal resource management. And the University of the Philippines in Visayas is very active in promoting women's capacity building in coastal resource management. Actually, they found out that women are more reliable to participate in projects like coastal resource management. So women are there, and they're taken charge of some important jobs in the coastal resource management. Well, how do we empower women? You just give capital. You are empowering them because they know what to do. There's no capital. Provide infrastructure and capital, and then target women. Tingnan mo, maging masaya yan, malaking fiesta yan. Okay? And there's another thing I want, can I answer the next question?
Yes, ma'am, of course. You may.
Okay. I told you about this book. Take a look at this. Can you see? This is the Garuda. Huh? This is an Indian motif. This is a Garuda excavated in Butuan. You know, we have a big expedition in Butuan, and it's continuing. The National Museum is continuing that. The problem with Indic studies is we are not promoting it. You know, we're not promoting it. There's a very interesting topic. It is a very interesting topic to work on. especially when you're doing archaeology, because most of our work, most of the evidence of Srivijaya can be found, or the Majapahit, in the archaeological evidence. The other thing is our belief system. In the belief system, if you look at, maybe it's, you start with the dictionary research, no? Bathala, Diwata. There are many loan words in Sanskrit that it's possible to begin with. But wala namang masipag na scholar to do that, o masipag na teacher to encourage, no? So please, to get encouraged, go to the Ayala Museum, and this is the gold. This is the heritage that we have. Then probably we share this with India, because the Indians, how how bejeweled their men and women are. If you look at the Ramayana, it's fantastic, no? And you look at the Boxer Codex, napaka ano elegant our men and women are in the jewelry section. You can start there, but it's very sad that it is not promoted, and we don't have really an Indologist. No, the last one was Francisco. Unfortunately, has passed away many years. No, yeah, that's what I want to
Thank you,
say.
Professor Zayas. Professor Ibieras, would you want to give it a crack? The second question about Indian culture and its influence on Philippine society, and how it's been maybe overlooked during the course of us writing our history, sir?
Well, I don't have much to add to what Dr. Saya said, because she's correct. She's correct. The problem is that it's not really being, it is being overlooked by our scholars, right? And then secondly, I think part of the explanation is uh, we tend to focus more on political impact rather than uh, social or cultural impact, right? Because political impact is easily discernible. You can see political impact immediately, and even economic impact you can see it immediately. Whereas cultural uh, cultural cultural impact is a little bit harder to unpack, right? Because it's deeply embedded, deeply embedded in our culture. It's a little bit difficult to extract. No, uh, it's not immediately visible. It's not immediately visible, especially if, like the terminology that Dr. Sayas mentioned, it has been deeply embedded in Filipino culture, right? So we think that Bathala, Diwata, all of that, that we think that they are Filipino terminologies, that they're uh, part of Filipino culture or indigenous culture, no? So it's a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder than, say, focusing on political or even economic impact, right? So yeah, I joined the call of Dr. Zayas that to encourage, especially our younger scholars, right? Our younger and budding scholars. I mean, this is an area that they can go into for their study, so that they can make a meaningful contribution to Philippine scholarship.
Thank you very much, Professor Ibiernas, for your response. We've pretty much consumed the time for the Q&A. At this point of the webinar, which is fast approaching its end, I'd like to request all the panelists and attendees, if you may, to activate your cameras so we can take group pictures so we can document this very meaningful and insightful webinar. I would request our OAM's colleagues to please give us the cue as to when the photo will be taken and if it's already all right to turn off the cameras. OAMs, please take the lead. I'll take.
Some people are not on. The videos are not on.
I'll
Can
just
you
give
turn on your.
Yes, Professor. I'll give the cue to the OAM's colleagues. On the count of three, please take our pictures. 1, 2, 3, smile. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. To close this morning's webinar, I invite Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office Deputy Assistant Secretary, Sir Emmanuel R. Fernandez, to give the closing remarks. Sir, please.
Thank you, Francis, and good day to everyone. On behalf of the Maritime and Ocean Affairs Office, I'd like to first of all thank our two lecturers, Professor Ibiernas and Dr. Zayas, for their very comprehensive and very engaging lectures. And of course, I'd like to thank Director Francis Herrera, Attorney Leslie Bustamante, and their team for organizing this very informative webinar. And last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you, both those from the Home Office, those from our Foreign Service Post, for attending this webinar today. Why don't we give everybody a virtual round of applause? You know, as I was listening to our two lecturers, I was reminded of what the American author and popular historian David McCullough once said about history. He said, and I quote, "History is who we are and why we are the way we are." Indeed, the study of history enables us to know who we are by giving us a better idea of the people, the events, the circumstances that have led us to where we are right now. Unfortunately, there is much about history that we Filipinos hardly know. For example, many Filipinos simply think of Magellan as the Spaniard who was killed by Lapu-Lapu. Lapu-Lapu is merely the killer of Magellan. As to why he killed Magellan, as to the economic and political dynamics behind the killing, these are details that we hardly know. The same is true about our pre-colonial women. We have a very simplistic, and if I may say so, a very one-dimensional portrait of pre-colonial women. We hardly know about their exact role, their identity in the making of Filipino history and in the molding of Philippine society. And that is why I am very, very glad that this morning, Professor Ibiernas and Dr. Zayas gave us a very comprehensive, a very textured portrait, not only of Lapu-Lapu, but of our pre-colonial women. This morning, my dear friends, we have been given the chance to look back on our history with a deepened sense of appreciation and a deepened sense of pride. But after this webinar, when we go back to our respective workplaces, I hope that we will bear in mind that every day we are likewise given the opportunity to take actions, to make decisions, to create pathways towards the future that could make the future generations of Filipinos equally proud of what we have done for their sakes. Again, thank you so much, and please, everyone, stay safe.
Sir Dr. Manuel Fernandez, thank you so much for the closing statements. And that's the end of this webinar. Thank you all for attending. Also, again, thank you to Professor Vicente Angel Ibernas and Professor Cynthia Nerizayas for agreeing to take part in this webinar. Lastly, I'd also like to thank our friends at the Office of Assets and Management and Support Services for their kind assistance and technical support behind the conduct of this webinar, particularly Assistant Secretary Medardo Macaraig, Mr. Rovel Tixon, Mr. Mark Espleta, and Ms. April Aliwalas. Thank you very much. And I wish us all a very pleasant afternoon and a very healthy lunch.